On the 29th of May, 1453, one of the most consequential days in human history began before sunrise. A city that had stood for over 1,000 years was about to fall. The Byzantine Empire, heir to the grandeur of ancient Rome, was drawing its final breath. Constantinople, the city at the crossroads of worlds, would by nightfall belong to another civilization entirely. What happened in those last hours was not merely the end of an empire, it was the closing of an entire age. The story of Constantinople's fall is a story of hubris and desperate courage, of ancient walls meeting new weapons, and of a civilization that refused to surrender its identity even as the ground shook beneath it. To understand why this city mattered so deeply, we must first understand what it was. Founded by the Roman Emperor Constantine the Great in 330 AD, Constantinople was planted on a narrow triangle of land where Europe and Asia nearly touch, the Bosphorus Strait threading between them like a silver needle. From those 7 hills, emperors had ruled a domain stretching from the Nile to the Danube. At its height, Constantinople was the largest and wealthiest city in Christendom. Its markets sold silk from China and spices from India. Its libraries preserved the texts of Aristotle and Plato. Its engineers built aqueducts that still stand. And encircling it all, the Theodosian walls, a triple-layered fortification of stone and brick stretching nearly 6 kilometers, studded with towers, fronted by a flooded moat. For over 1,000 years, those walls had never been breached from the outside. Armies had tried. The Avars had tried in 626. The Arab Caliphate had tried twice in 674 and 717. The Rus had tried. The Bulgars had tried. Each time the walls held, each time the city survived. But by the spring of 1453, Constantinople was a shadow of what it had once been. A century of plague, civil war, and the relentless pressure of the rising Ottoman state had hollowed it out. The population that had once numbered perhaps 500,000 souls now stood at somewhere between 40 and 50,000. Vast districts inside the walls lay abandoned, reduced to fields and vegetable gardens. The great palaces were crumbling, the treasury was bare. The emperor himself, Constantine the Vaftid Palaiologos, ruled not an empire but a city, and barely that. He commanded roughly 7,000 defenders to hold walls that needed at least 50,000. He had sent desperate appeals to the courts of Western Europe for crusading armies that never came. He had accepted a controversial union with the Roman Catholic Church in exchange for promised military aid, an act that alienated many of his own Orthodox subjects and still delivered almost nothing. The Venetians sent a handful of ships. The Genoese merchant colony at Galata, just across the Golden Horn, quietly calculated which way the wind was blowing. And outside those ancient walls, the wind was blowing unmistakably from one direction. Sultan Mehmed II was 21 years old when he led his army to the gates of Constantinople in April of 1453. He had inherited the throne twice, briefly as a child, then permanently at 19 after his father Murad II died. The courts of Europe had dismissed him as a young hothead, inexperienced and reckless. They were catastrophically wrong. Mehmed was a reader of histories, a student of military science, a speaker of several languages, and a man possessed by a singular obsession: the conquest of Constantinople. Islamic tradition held that the Prophet Muhammad himself had praised the commander who would one day take the great city. Mehmed intended to be that commander. He had spent years preparing. He had studied the failed sieges of the past and identified the single decisive factor. No army before him had brought sufficient firepower to seriously threaten the Theodosian walls. So he found a solution. He commissioned a Hungarian engineer named Urban, who had actually first offered his services to Constantinople. Constantine VII could not afford him. Mehmed could. Urban built for the Sultan a cannon unlike anything the world had seen, a barrel of bronze roughly 8 meters long, capable of hurling a stone ball weighing over half a metric ton. Contemporaries recorded that its firing could be heard from 40 kilometers away. This weapon, and the artillery park that accompanied it, transformed the siege from the moment it opened. The Ottomans arrived in early April with an army that modern historians estimate at between 60 and 80,000 men, supported by a fleet of over 100 vessels closing the sea approaches. Mehmed's artillery began its systematic work on the walls almost immediately. Each day, the great guns fired. Each night, the Byzantine defenders, exhausted, chronically short of manpower, scrambled to fill the breaches with rubble, barrels of earth, and wooden palisades. For 7 weeks, this brutal rhythm continued. The defenders fought with extraordinary tenacity. The Genoese commander Giovanni Giustiniani Longo had arrived with a small but highly professional force and proved himself a gifted tactician, directing the defense of the critical land walls with cool efficiency. The Venetian sailors chained their ships across the mouth of the Golden Horn, blocking the Ottoman fleet from attacking the sea walls. For a time, against every reasonable expectation, the defenders held. Then came a moment of audacious Ottoman ingenuity that shifted the balance of the entire campaign. The Venetian chain across the Golden Horn had so far denied Mehmed's fleet access to the calmer harbour waters and the shorter sea walls. Mehmed's solution was breathtaking in its ambition. He ordered his engineers to construct a greased wooden trackway over the hill of Galata, dragging 70 or more of his lighter warships overland, out of the Bosphorus, and relaunching them directly into the Golden Horn behind the chain. It was a feat of organizational brilliance that stunned the Byzantine defenders when they woke to find an Ottoman fleet already inside the harbour. Now the exhausted garrison had to defend an even longer perimeter. Each soldier who had been resting was pulled back to the walls. Morale frayed. Sleep deprivation took its toll, and still the guns fired. By the night of the 28th of May, Mehmed had concluded that the walls were sufficiently weakened and his army sufficiently prepared for a full and final assault. He ordered his men to rest, to pray, to prepare. He lit the Ottoman camp with torches and bonfires, and the sound of drums and pipes rolled across the plain. Some accounts say the defenders on the walls could see the light and hear the noise from kilometers away, and understood perfectly what it meant. Inside the city, Constantine V attended a final liturgy at Hagia Sophia. He is said to have asked forgiveness of his courtiers and officers, embraced them, and ridden to his post at the walls. No one present that night, on either side of those walls, would have doubted that the morning would be decisive. The assault began in the darkest hours before dawn on the 29th of May. Mehmed sent his irregular troops first, the Bashi bazouks lightly armed and expendable in his tactical calculus. To probe the defences and exhaust the defenders, they were beaten back. Then came Anatolian regulars, who pressed harder and also fell back. Then, after 2 hours of grinding combat, Mehmed committed his elite janissaries, the finest infantry in the Ottoman world, disciplined, heavily armed, and fresh. At the same moment, a disaster unfolded on the Byzantine side. Giovanni Giustiniani, the indispensable Genoese commander, was struck by a projectile. The accounts differ on whether it was an arrow or a firearm shot, and wounded severely enough that he asked to be carried from the walls. His withdrawal at this critical moment shattered the morale of the defenders around him. A gate was opened to carry him out. Some of the soldiers nearby, seeing the gate ajar and their commander departing, broke. Within moments, the Janissaries found a small postern gate, the Kirkeporta, reportedly left unlocked in the chaos. They pushed through. The cry went up, "The city has fallen! The city has fallen!" It was not a controlled collapse. It was a fracture, sudden and total. Constantine the Vathine, by every account we possess, refused to flee. The last emperor of Rome, of the line that traced itself, however tenuously, all the way back to Augustus, reportedly tore off his imperial regalia, drew his sword, and charged into the press of fighting. His body was never conclusively identified. He simply disappeared into the battle, into history, into legend. The sack that followed lasted 3 days, as was the custom that Mehmed had promised his troops. A promise that was in some measure honoured, though by some accounts the Sultan moved to curtail the worst of it when he entered the city. The treasures of 1,000 years were carried off or destroyed. Libraries were scattered. The great mosaic-covered churches were stripped. Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom, the greatest building in the Christian world, was converted to a mosque. The city that had called itself the New Rome, the Second Rome, the Queen of Cities, passed into Ottoman hands. Mehmed entered Constantinople on the evening of the 29th and reportedly wept at the desolation, or so the chronicles tell us. Whether the tears were genuine grief or theatrical performance, no one can say. What is clear is that he immediately set about rebuilding the city as his new imperial capital, which he would rename Istanbul. He invited peoples of all faiths to repopulate it. He preserved much of its administrative structure. He styled himself, among his other titles, Kaiser-i-Rum, Caesar of Rome. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves across Europe and the Islamic world alike. For the Christian West, it was an epoch-defining catastrophe, the death of the empire that had been the eastern shield of Christendom. Greek scholars who fled the city carried their manuscripts westward, where they fertilized the intellectual soil of the Renaissance already underway in Italy. The Ottoman Empire, now astride the main overland trade routes between Europe and Asia, would reshape the economics of the known world. European merchants and navigators would spend the following decades desperately seeking sea routes around the Ottoman blockade, and in doing so, stumble upon the Americas. History does not move in straight lines, but if you trace the threads, they lead through that gate at Constantinople, through that unlocked postern door, to the caravels of Columbus, to the spice routes of Vasco da Gama, to the world we recognize today. Yet perhaps the most haunting question the fall of Constantinople leaves us is this: what exactly died with it? Byzantium had been the living bridge between classical antiquity and the medieval world, preserving, translating, transmitting the knowledge of Greece and Rome for 1,000 years, while Western Europe rebuilt itself from the ruins of the old empire. When that bridge finally broke, something irreplaceable went with it. Entire libraries lost, entire traditions severed, entire lineages of scholarship extinguished. We cannot know what we do not know we have lost, and so we are left with a city that no longer exists as it was, its churches transformed, its emperors gone, its walls still standing but belonging to another story entirely. We are left with a young sultan weeping, or pretending to weep, in the ruins of a civilization his cannon had destroyed. And we are left with Constantine IV, last emperor, vanished into the chaos of that final morning. A man who chose to die with his city rather than outlive it. Was that nobility or futility? Perhaps in the end it was both.